I see that opportunity moving forward, especially as these key states like your Floridas, your Pennsylvanias unlock. But also when I look back and I say, how did we get here? What did we miss? We've been wrong, and the projections have been wrong about how quickly this industry was going to grow. And if you put on your bearish hat, you can say, yeah, that's because
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Jesse Redmond, Managing Director of Water Tower Research. Jesse, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I am doing well. Excited to be here, guys. Long-time listener, first-time caller, as we used to say in the radio days. Remember those call-in shows? We'd say long-time listener, first-time caller. So I guess I'm long-time listener, first-time guest. So I'm excited to be here.
Excited to have you here. Kellen, how are you doing?
Doing really well. Really excited to talk to Jesse. Really excited to dive into cannabis investing. I know it's a big topic. I'm a retail investor, so really excited to break down Jesse's view and kind of get all of the nuances associated with the industry. How are you doing, Brian? Also, excited that I have a West Coaster to represent on the pod as well. So West Coast is going to hold it down today.
That's fine. I got nothing. You're absolutely right, Kellen. Yes. Jesse, we'll put you on the record, but I am very stoked to kind of talk about investing. I think it's kind of crazy when you kind of put from like a macro standpoint of like how far we've come, yet also how far we still have to come. And I think for me, sometimes I balance like, am I still as excited as I was? Did I miss something? Is something wrong? And we're going to kind of break down all those nuances today because I don't think there's anybody better that is more into the know about the space and also has like a really strong level-headed approach, which is very challenging given the industry and how it works. So before we dive in all the fun stuff, Jesse, East Coast, West Coast battle, how to put yourself on the map. Where are you putting it?
Yeah, so this is an easy one for me, guys. I grew up in Minnesota, and when I went to college, I spent a couple of years at Boulder and then finished at UCSB in Santa Barbara, and I've been one place or another in California ever since, and it just fits me well. In my old job, I visited 48 of our 50 states and went to the East Coast a ton because I worked in the investment business and do love New York and the culture out there, but if it comes down to where I want to live, it is 100% on the West Coast.
All right, Jesse. So can you give me a little background about yourself and kind of how you found your way to the cannabis space?
Oh, man. Yeah. So I think a lot of us that got here have a unique, if not slightly weird path to getting here. When you're in such a nascent, emerging industry, I think you have to have a lot of passion to be here. And I think it also helps to have a why to be here, not just the what, but the why are you here? And I think that helps your connection, if we want to get woo-woo, connection with the plant and those sorts of things, but also gives you staying power during these more difficult times. And I definitely had a bit of a weird path to get here and definitely have a why that I am here. So my background, guys, I mentioned going to college, studied economics. I always thought I was going to do something in business. That's been my passion my whole life. I graduated from UCSB, moved to San Francisco to work for Franklin Templeton, big mutual fund company, and then Fisher Investments, and then moved back to Santa Barbara to co-manage a fund called Santa Barbara Market Neutral Fund, which is a market neutral hedge fund. That led me to spend about a decade managing a couple hedge funds, founding my own hedge fund eventually. And then my whole life, my dad's had a chronic pain problem called chronic regional pain syndrome. And it's this horrible thing where pain moves around your body and they can't figure out why. So you get the MRIs, you get the x-rays, you get the exams. They say, sir, you look fine. And then you go home and you have crippling pain that moves around your body. So my dad got this from a couple of car accidents he was in when I was a kid. And by the time he was my age, he was forced to retire, was disabled, and had never worked again. And to manage that pain and situation, he went down the opiates route, got to the point where he was taking hundreds of milligrams of OxyContin a day. And in kind of 2013, 14, 15 area, he started using cannabis and started seeing a proper cannabis doctor. And I say proper cannabis doctor because cannabis doctor in California could mean just a guy with dreadlocks who writes you a medical prescription, every year and collects his $40. This is somebody who actually, really understood the different cannabinoids, ways to blend them, and specifically ways to help people get off opiates using cannabis and using cannabis to manage their pain. So over a couple year period, he went from taking, like I said, hundreds of milligrams of OxyContin to taking zero, and the quality of his life just drastically improved from things like CBD, CBG tincture more than CBD, CBG helped him. and using things like flour for relief. So I got him a volcano vaporizer, and he grinds up flour and uses that for relief during the daytime when he needs something more than his tinctures. So I say all of that to paint a picture where I'm deep in the hedge fund industry in my, I guess, early 40s at the time. I was a cannabis consumer most of my life. It tends to work better for me than alcohol. And I was looking at this California landscape saying, well, I see that adult use is probably going to happen here in the next few years. I'm learning that cannabis does have massive medical benefits that I had heard about, but I'd never really looked into or much less seen firsthand. And I was getting burnt out, guys, from the investment business. You know, it's cliche, but it's true that if you go hard at something like that for 10, 15, 20 years, it just gets to be exhausting. So I was kind of in the mood for a change and decided to make the somewhat drastic decision to close the last hedge fund work that I was doing and open a dispensary in California. So I opened a store here in about early 2016. And then I ran that for 3 years up until 2019. And then once we got into what we call Prop 64 here, which are the adult use regulations, a single store in California wasn't going to be a profitable enough venture to make it. And so I decided to close that and take the 20 years of investing experience, and at that time, 3 years of running a cannabis business experience, and start to focus on that intersection of cannabis and investing.
I love it. And I appreciate you bringing us full circle. So let's talk about investing in cannabis. Is the thesis still correct? Do we still face a generational opportunity?
So, Brian, I think there's a fine line between being early and being wrong. And I think we're walking it. And I think it would be disingenuous to categorically say that we're certainly early, right? There's no question about that. Anybody that's been here, MSOS peaked on February 10th, 2021 at $55.10 per share. Here we are almost 4 years later, and we're down over 80%. So we're for sure early. I'm not convinced that we're wrong, although there is a fine line between being early and wrong. And if you bought at 55, it's going to take a heck of a long time to get back there. But the reason I came here was because I saw this setup of a state-led growth story with a series of hard-to-time political catalysts that I thought at the time may take something like 3 to 5 years to meaningfully play out. And I was wrong about that. That was right around 2020. And to unpack this a little bit, when I say state-led growth story, it's unique that we have 24 adult use states and we have 26 left to convert from a medical program, and in some cases don't even really have medical programs. And then of those 24 adult use states, we have ones like where you live in New York that are a mess but getting better, but still have a lot of opportunity. And we have ones like we have in California, which is a mess and slowly getting better. So there's big opportunities in existing states to grow. But that growth story compelled me with the 24 adult use states, 26 still left to convert. The other piece of the puzzle, guys, is this notion of a series of underlining the words hard to time political catalysts. And those are things like safe banking. Those are things like Schedule 3. Those are things like the potential for something like a Garland memo. Those are things like decriminalization or legalization, which is super topical with Kabbalah's comments today. And also somewhere along that path, hopefully we pick up uplisting. So I looked at this small sector that looked like it had a lot of TAM expansion from the 20s, from basically doubling the amount of adult use states, and then a lot of value to unlock through these series of political catalysts. And I think that story is still intact. I would just say that the political progress has been super slow, and nothing on that list that I just gave you, those 4 or 5 things, has happened. The state-led growth story has also been a bit slower. It's proving, guys, that it takes longer for things to happen in cannabis, and it's generally more expensive, but it always takes longer than we expect. I feel like the thesis is still intact, but I will say we're at kind of a critical junction here as we head into 25. We can talk more about it later, but with Schedule 3 looming in huge states like Florida, I think it's a really important year to get those 2 things done, Schedule 3 and Florida adult use. And then also critical to see how does that change the landscape? Are those types of events enough to bring in new capital?
I think that we should talk of that because my question from a retail investment perspective is we see these catalysts, right? Okay, say Florida doesn't pass, right? What does that do to Trulieve stock? What does that do to all of the MSOs that have poured money into that market? I know there's still the medical market, right? But it shouldn't hurt it, or does it, right? Like, how does that play out worst case scenario in your mind, Jesse?
Yeah, I don't think that's a total disaster in the sense that you do still have a strong and highly profitable medical market. So one problem we've seen, guys, is in states, margins tend to degrade pretty quickly. And initially, pounds will be really expensive. There'll be high margins. And then we have something called price compression that occurs over time, and market margins degrade. In Florida, you have a unique structure where it's 100% vertical. So if Trulieve sells flower in their store, they grow it. If they sell pre-rolls, they grew that flower and they made those pre-rolls. Same thing for extracts and everything else. And so it's a challenging market because you have to be great at a bunch of different things, but it does have healthier margins than markets where you have those, where you have those disparate pieces where you could be vertical, but you could also be a specialist in cultivation or a specialist in retail or extraction or anywhere else along the supply chain. So I think it still stays a good market, but if you just look at the amount of investments being made, specifically by Trulieve, you can tell how important it is for this to pass. I mean, Trulieve, you're talking about 140 stores in Florida. There's about 470 MSO-owned stores in Florida. So massive opportunity for the industry, but specifically for Trulieve, a huge opportunity. And there's also a couple of smaller operators where things get really interesting. Air, so huge percent of their footprint with 70 stores that are relatively small market cap. Then going down even smaller, you look at businesses like Consortium or even Planet 13 with the recent VitaCan acquisition. So it's a big deal for the industry, but there's also pieces where it doesn't matter, right? So let's talk about, Glass House Brands in California. Let's talk about clients of ours like Leaf Brands or Gold Floor in California. They're not going to be impacted, by Florida, and some of the MSOs like Ascend isn't in Florida, TerraSense not in Florida, so it doesn't hit everybody quite the same. So I would say that not getting Schedule 3 would be, maybe a disaster is a strong word, but that's the word that came to mind. Like that would be really challenging, especially for the operators that are struggling more. But Florida, I think, is critical, but I don't think it would be quite as devastating as not getting Schedule 3.
I think that's perfect, right? And I just got to go back to what you said before, Jesse, because maybe this is the optimist in me hearing what you're saying is if I just remove everything that happened in the last 4 years, and I just took what you said opening up about the opportunities and the catalysts ahead, the major state reform coming on, and understanding that things take a little longer in cannabis to go forward, there's prime real estate in front of us. Some of these companies can get some of these shackles unlocked. Maybe that's not the best visual to use, but it kind of feels like things are harder here. But if you get unlocked, some of these companies can absolutely explode. And someone like my dad, who I kind of pulled in as I got early into the space, I feel bad, like the timing is such a critical aspect. So for people that are maybe new, do you think like it's hard to separate like from the past and going forward in order to balance that timing is such a critical aspect when investing in the space?
Yeah, timing certainly is critical, Brian. I think also there's two other components to it. And those are, what is your time horizon and what percent allocation are you making to this space? So when I see people really in angst and really pissed off and really hurt and really devastated, generally they put too much of their portfolio into cannabis, and their time horizon for the catalyst playing out or to let that investment run is too short. And so let's unpack that a little bit. So I'm not in the financial advisor business and not in the business of giving investment advice, but there's a real difference between putting 5% of your portfolio in something that's speculative like cannabis, the same perspective you might take to an emerging market or crypto, where these are risky investments and probably should size them smaller. So I'm not saying 5% is the right number, but you would sleep differently if you had 5% of your portfolio in cannabis versus if you had 50%. And so you can figure out what that right number is for you based on your risk tolerance, your time horizon, and your confidence in this thesis. But I would encourage everyone to think about, what's the appropriate allocation to cannabis? And number two is, what is your time horizon for harvesting this opportunity? No pun intended. I think that I originally talked about 3 to 5 years, and that was back in 2020. And here we are, 5 years would put us into next year. It's taking way longer for this thesis to play out than I initially hoped or expected. And so I think moving forward, 3 to 5 is the minimum. 4 to 6 years maybe makes more sense. And even going a decade may make the most sense, because if you go to the full decade, maybe we'll bring in states like Texas and other big players in the South. We have a lot of the Midwest that still needs to be built out from an adult use perspective. And then these set of political catalysts like Schedule 3, hopefully we're staring in the face for next year. Safer banking, who the heck knows, that could happen in the lame duck or never. But things like decriminalization and legalization and getting to uplisting, I think you need to give yourself a few years for these catalysts to play out. So I think the opportunity definitely still exists, but I think people that want to pursue it need to do so with a responsible allocation to their portfolio and a reasonable time frame to let these events play out.
I think expanding on that, it's hard, right? Because from a pessimistic standpoint, we've been burned so many times in the past by politicians making promises and then not delivering. But there is a tiny percentage, and maybe again, this is the optimist in me coming out, that says Florida passes, we get some rescheduling, we get some other potential reform, and these catalysts start accelerating each other, which could really see excitement take to a whole nother level, right? Because it feels like people just been saddened or maybe hardened from just no action. But eventually we will get some of this movement, and then it could really accelerate pretty quickly because some of these companies are set up to really to go if we get some of these unlockings.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the new states aren't going to stop opening. So we focused on Florida because it's so meaningful with 22 million residents, 137 million tourists. Just the resident population flipping from medical to adult use presents an opportunity. But those 137 million tourists are one of the coolest parts about Florida because under the medical program, they can't buy cannabis. But under adult use, the snowbirds, the spring breakers, all of those people could now buy legal cannabis in Florida. So it's right to spend a lot of time focusing on Florida. But there's other states too. Pennsylvania, we hope goes adult use next year. Virginia, is also on the horizon, which is huge for a number of the MSOs like the Cannabis, Jushi, and others. And the whole Midwest, we're just starting in Minnesota, which is big for GTI and Vireo, but all the states that border that, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, none of those have adult use. And so the state-led growth story isn't going to stop. And I think that what you're saying, Bryan, is correct, where I think it does start to gain momentum and snowball, especially as we flip more of these red states. And then you start to get, politicians, the senators coming from these red states that see the value of the cannabis program, see how it's not really a threat. Like one thing I think, guys, is a huge misunderstanding of the industry is that adult use cannabis is dangerous, when in fact it just makes things safer. Like I have teenage kids and I love that cannabis is adult use here. They are so sick of me talking about cannabis, and they see stores around town because in Santa Barbara, there's a number of stores, and I'll say, oh, there's my client's store over there. Oh, there's Graham's store over there. And they're just exhausted with the whole thing. And so they're exhausted with it. And also they need to have an ID to be 21 or older to access the dispensaries. And I think that's the right framework versus trying to hide it from people and having dealers that they can go to. Dealers don't care if you're underage. And so I think that we do get a bit of a tipping point as some of these bigger states, especially some of these red states, start to flip. But I really think momentum could pick up. We could have a scenario here, guys, where November 5th, Florida flips. We have the ALJ hearing in December. Maybe that gets finalized Q1 or Q2 of next year. That could be followed in short order by a Garland memo clarifying things like the FDA's involvement, things like states' rights under Schedule 3, and then we'll see what's going on politically. There's a lot of signaling that for the first time, both Democrats and Republicans could be broadly in favor of reform. We've been misled or perhaps lied to about that in the past, so we don't get too excited. But it does feel like things are changing. So I agree, Bryan. We could see a lot of these boxes get checked in literally like 18 months. But because it's cannabis and because things tend to take longer than we expect, I think it's better. I think it's better to have a more realistic expectation and give yourself a longer time horizon and be grateful and happier if it comes sooner.
How do all these catalysts, does this balance the playing field for cannabis and hemp essentially? And how does one kind of determine if these cannabis companies are involved in hemp? How does that impact these companies as a whole? Like kind of talk through like how the hemp industry is impacting a lot of the cannabis industry, right? Like you mentioned in Florida, right? Adult use provides the opportunity for tourists to purchase Delta-9 THC in flower, but they could also go to a gas station right now and purchase some Delta-9 in a beverage, right? And that's all from this loophole within the hemp industry and the farm bill, right? So do you think that if all of these catalysts that you just touched on occur, that it does level the playing field for marijuana companies or cannabis companies and hemp companies?
I would say takes steps in that direction, but I don't think it absolutely levels it. Hemp still has the D2C opportunity, right? The direct-to-consumer opportunity. So if you're Glasshouse Brands in California, you can't ship your flower nationally. You can't run ads on Instagram and convert those and ship them your flower. But if Glasshouse grew, what they call farm bill flower or THCA flower with less than 0.3% THC, but all the THCA that you want, and just mind you, when you put a lighter to it or heat it up, that THCA turns to THC. So we're really just talking about the same thing. We're just talking about exploiting a loophole in that 2018 Farm Bill. And so I don't know that it absolutely levels the playing field, but I think that it brings them closer when right now there is such a mismatch. I mean, in many ways, hemp is living the dream that cannabis wishes, right? We wish we didn't have 280E. We wish we could ship across state lines. We wish we had interstate commerce. We wish USPS would deliver it. We wish we could, place ads on social media and convert people. And so I don't know that it instantly changes all of those things, but I think it brings them closer. And maybe what happens is we meet in the middle where hemp, even saying hemp these days, guys, is a tough one, right? Because there's so many types of hemp: industrial hemp, intoxicating hemp, THCA flower, minor cannabinoids. There's all these different types of hemp out there. But I think we maybe see a convergence where we see some more regulations on the hemp side and a loosening on the cannabis side. And perhaps those things need to eventually meet in the middle.
I love the way you just broke that down. You're like, it's the same, but different. People are like, I don't understand. Like, will I get higher? Will I not, Jesse?
Yeah.
Like, that's all I want to know.
Yep.
So let's play a scenario, right? Like, given your background from an investing community, let's say somebody is looking to learn about the industry. How do you explain to them investment in cannabis? It's all the companies are not kind of the same. It's very nuanced. There's opportunities at play, but there's also limitations at play. But there's companies like Glasshouse that have massive opportunities, but also have the ability to kind of pivot with the left and right. How do you explain to someone all these nuances to make it make sense?
So I asked them if they have 2 hours first, and then we sit down. No, it is a complicated thing, but I think there's analogies that can be helpful. So coming from the investment industry, or specifically the hedge fund business, but I think this applies broadly across the investment industry. You have multi-strategy funds, like a multi-strategy mutual fund, which will invest in value, it'll invest in growth, it'll invest in foreign, it'll invest in domestic, it'll have a bunch of different strategies it's diversified across that gets you broader exposure to a group of investments. Then you have specialists, right? You could have somebody that just specializes in mining stocks, tech stocks, energy stocks. You could have a value manager, a growth manager. There's all sorts of specializations in the industry. And I think cannabis is kind of the same way. So I think of what we call the U.S. multi-state operators. We call those MSOs. I think of those as being like the multi-strategy investment managers, where through an investment in one company, you can get access to hundreds of retail stores. You can get access to, 5, 10, a dozen different states, and get access to cultivation, retail, extraction. And you can really diversify your portfolio by investing in a GTI, a Trulieve, a Cresco, a Verano, any of the real, what we call tier 1 MSOs, which are basically the top 5 enterprise value. You can instantly diversify your portfolio by investing in those more diversified businesses. Then around that, we have specialists. There are some smaller MSOs, like just off of the tier 1s. You have TerraSend, Ascend, Jushi, Air. All of those are diversified, just not quite as big. But when you fall a bit under those, then you can get into some specialists. Like you mentioned Glasshouse Brands, which is a specialist in California. Really, they have retail, but really a specialist at growing affordable, good quality greenhouse flower. You have specialists like our client Leaf Brands, where they're dominating the bulk extract business in California. So there you're getting more specific by saying, put me in California, but also put me in extracts. We could talk about other examples like Grown Rogue, who is currently in Oregon and Michigan, and their edge is in low cost craft cultivation, and they're trying to bring that to higher margin markets like Illinois and New Jersey. And so we're starting to get a little deeper here. And I think when you get down to this next level where we're getting outside of those top 5 names, then it gets a little more complicated, understanding the nuances, the markets that they're in. But you could plug into some of those bigger names to instantly diversify your portfolio. Or guys, we're unique because we have this MSOS ETF, which just dominates the industry from a liquidity perspective. And it's, NYSE listed. And so it has better access, it has better liquidity. And that's basically focused on the top 5 names. It has a bunch more positions in it, but I think it's over 80% of the portfolios in the top 5 names. So if somebody just wants general exposure to US cannabis, MSOS would offer that. Or if somebody says, hey, why don't you throw in some international stuff? Give me some Canada as well. There are also ETFs you can look into. YOLO, ticker YOLO, is another one that people could look at. My friend Aaron Edelheit is an advisor to the TOKE ETF, TOKE, and that has a little bit different thematic exposure. So there's a couple different ways to go about it. Maybe first you say, hey, do I want to be in an ETF and get that instant diversification, or do I want to be a stock picker? And then if you decide, hey, I'm willing to do the work to be a stock picker, maybe pick up a couple of those larger MSOs to give you some diversification in your portfolio. And that could kind of be your core strategy, for lack of a better term. And then on the satellite or on the edges, if you wanted to be clever, you could start to look at some of those names like your Glass Houses, your Leaf Brands, your Grown Rogues, some of those smaller stocks that may have opportunities in more specific markets.
So during the gold rush, like a lot of gold miners went broke, right? And they said that it was really good to be like a pick and shovel company, right? So in cannabis, there's got to be some pick and shovel entities out there. So is there like Scott's Miracle Grow, right? Is there other like publicly traded companies outside that might be a good like investment that provides stability because they are already diversified, but they are exposed to the industry, as well as are there like cannabis specific companies that are only providing services to the cannabis industry from an ancillary perspective, and they're not plant touching, right? So that gives them upside in terms of 280E and kind of these other limitations that we just touched on.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Love the pick and shovels analogy. That's that's the kind of the genesis of Levi Strauss. Applies really well to the cannabis industry, and you're 100% right on there. I would take a look. Yeah, Scott's Miracle Grow is one example, but more pure exposure, and someone who happens to be a client of ours is Hydrofarm, ticker HYFM, and they provide things like lights and nutrients and all the things you need to grow cannabis, whether it's indoors or outdoors. They also are in what we call the CEA space, controlled environmental agriculture. So if you think about, just for me, I've been growing cannabis in my backyard for the last 7 years just to get to know the plant better. And it turns out that I was using their Roots Organic nutrient line. Turns out I was using Hydrofarm's brand of Smart Pots to put my 100 gallons of soil in. And turns out I was using their Fox Farm soil as my primary medium. So me as a hobby grower was using their pots, I was using their soil, and I'm using their nutrients to grow cannabis in my backyard. And so Hydrofarm is a great way to get that exposure. But they also have things that are great for more commercial type applications, different sorts of nutrients lines, and also, like I mentioned, the lighting, the fixtures, the fans, everything you need to grow cannabis, Hydrofarm makes. And so, yes, I think that subsector of cannabis has been pretty washed out, kind of in the post-COVID, the interest in gardening and growing at home slowed. And also we had that big cultivation boom where cultivation in a lot of West Coast markets got really overly built in 22, 23, maybe even into 21. That feels like it's starting to correct itself. And so I think through burning off some of that extra capacity, along with some of these new states turning on, that some of these pick and shovel stories could become more attractive. So I'd look at Hydrofarm. Another one that gets forgotten about, guys, is Weed Maps, right? And so Weed Maps was critical when I started my dispensary back in, I guess it was right around 2016. And for discovery, it was huge. I mean, people used the app. That's where they found us. That's where they left reviews. We could link up verified products to it. It was really the backbone of our business. And technology has evolved, and people are building their own websites more, and there are competitors out there. And Weed Maps also went down some roads that in hindsight didn't turn out to be super well. They got distracted with some different SaaS offerings and ways to diversify the business that didn't work out, I think, quite like they hoped. But like a lot of cannabis companies, they're kind of returning to their core, returning to what they're good at, focusing on their key markets, focusing on what works best. And that's a story that is really cleaning up as well. So I think, the pick and shovels analogy is great. And a couple of ways you could do that would be with a Hydrofarm or with Weed Maps.
I think that's what makes like investing in cannabis so kind of unique, right? You've got the cannabis companies who are solely focused on cannabis. And then you've got these other big companies who are like, we're going to diversify our revenue outside as like a vertical to grow our businesses. So do you think any US cannabis companies are going to diversify out of cannabis into, let's say, growing tomatoes?
I guess I think the answer to that is only if you have to, right? Because Glasshouse is doing the opposite. If you go out to their huge greenhouse in Camarillo, which is about an hour from me, that can be, I think it's over 6 million square feet when fully planted. And they bought that from Casey Howlings, and he was a tomato farmer, and they were growing pickles, peppers, and tomatoes in the greenhouses. And in some of the greenhouses, they still are. And so Glasshouse effectively sublets those out to the Howlings family, and they still grow produce in there, while Glasshouse is, building up their business so they can eventually use all of the greenhouses there. So yeah, I know that you say that's somewhat in jest, Brian, but I think the real answer is that they would do that if they have to. But ideally, if cannabis prices, stay where they are, like, price compression was a big issue for the past few years. Still isn't awesome. Really depends on the market. Hard to generalize. But flower prices nationally are down about 5% this year, which isn't going up, but at least it's not going down 15, 20, 30% like we did in previous years. So we're right around $1,000 a pound average nationally. So I think if we can hold around 1,000 or get better, that will probably stick with growing cannabis instead of tomatoes.
100% agree. And you're right. I was just having fun with the word.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, right, like if I saw one of those large operators do it, I think it would be like a red flag for me, and I'd be concerned that maybe there was bigger problems going on.
Yeah.
Because you're right, like with these vertical integration companies, they've got opportunities across the supply chain to really specialize in. And if you're not really locking down on your operational efficiencies, you're really letting margins slip through the gaps, because that's one of the unique aspects of cannabis, is that they've got all these vertical integrations in these individual states, which, yes, horrible to spin up, but very economically beneficial from them currently, the way some of these markets operate.
Yep, I think you are right on there, but I think it probably goes the other way. I think even with Village Farms and others, as the industry gets healthier, we stop growing the vegetables, we start growing more of the cannabis.
What about M&A roll-up strategies? Do you think if we get some of these catalysts going, that somebody from the outside industry, maybe a big tobacco company, could be interested in coming in and saying, okay, I like the operations in these 3 states. I think this is the way positioned forward. Do you think that those conversations are currently happening now?
Yes, those conversations are happening. A couple tangible examples there on LinkedIn. Reynolds, I think it's Reynolds American is the name of a big tobacco company in the U.S. They are advertising a position for their what they call their Beyond Nicotine business, which is their cannabis business, and that's a director of finance position that's been around for a few months and just got reposted recently. So they haven't filled that position, but continue to try to fill it. I got contacted by a recruiter, I guess maybe a month or two ago now, that was looking to have a conversation about one of their clients, which was a large tobacco company that was looking to build out a North American or specifically U.S. tobacco plan or U.S. cannabis business and figure out how to enter the U.S. cannabis market. So those are different companies that I'm talking about. So there's two examples I know firsthand of companies looking to hire senior people to build out these businesses. So yeah, I think that absolutely does happen. The question is, when does that really start to take off? And maybe the answer is with the finalization of Schedule 3. One thing we're seeing, guys, we saw this at the Benzinga conference, is there's a lot of interesting conversations taking place, but there aren't a lot of deals happening right now. And I think, the fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me sort of thing, mindset really permeates the industry, where cannabis has become the ultimate show me story. We've been faked by safe banking so many times that people just don't believe that these key pieces of reform are going to happen. But I think with Schedule 3, again, ALJ hearing December 2nd, hopefully, not a prediction, just saying hopefully get a final ruling sometime first or second quarter of next year. And I think that's when you might start to see some of this activity go from conversations to actual actions.
And so with those actions, do you think that big tobacco will enter like the recreational supply chain? Because we've heard, I think British American or British BAC, right? British American Company, or I'm not pronouncing that correctly.
You got it.
But they were involved in cannabis a couple of years ago, but their involvement was investments in like more pharmaceutical kind of driven plays, where they were investing in like companies doing metabolic engineering to create APIs and stuff like that. Not even close to like a recreational play in my mind, at least. And so I'm really curious to see if you think from an M&A perspective, they'll go after like cultivation, recreation to kind of build out a portfolio similar to like smoking tobacco as a cigarette, right? Or you think they'll diversify into kind of like the pharmaceutical play?
No, I think it's more about the recreational side of it. I think it was Wayne Gretzky with the quote, "I skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck has been." And right now, tobacco is where the puck has been. There's some other products out there like the vaping stuff and like the pouches, the Zyn stuff that's offsetting some of the continued degradation of the core tobacco business. But people, just by and large aren't smoking cigarettes anymore, not smoking them like they used to. And you see that more and more with the younger generations. I'm super happy to see that, cannabis is growing in popularity while drinking is becoming less popular and smoking is becoming even way less popular. So there are absolutely these businesses, the tobacco businesses have been spitting off a ton of cash flow, paying healthy dividends. So they have money to put to work. And if they look around the world and saying, oh, what's close to me that I can tap into that's actually growing and has a lot of similarities to where we've had success in the past, I think cannabis is the most obvious choice. Could diversify into other things like beverages, or alcohol rather than just beverages, but alcohol. But even alcohol, the seltzers perk that space up a little bit, but the craft beer market does okay. But by and large, the alcohol business is really tough. So if I can figure out this notion of state-led growth story with a series of political catalysts, you can be certain they understand it as well or better. And so I think that they will enter the U.S. legal cannabis market, and I think they'll probably diversify. Certainly cultivation is where they would logically have their edge, but cultivating tobacco at the kind of scale they are really isn't how most smokable flower is grown, right? Like I love sun-grown stuff, but let's just generalize and say that most popular smokable flower is indoor and, grown under lights, grown in cocoa or, hydroponically, those different methods. That's not how big tobacco farms work. So I'm sure that they could find some synergies and figure it out pretty quickly. But I would think that the opportunity for them could be very well on the pharmaceutical side as well. But I'm guessing, participating in the state-led growth story in the legal markets would be a great interest as well.
Maybe a spliff, right?
Yeah, right. But that I know you say that jokingly, but that's hard. It's hard in legal markets to blend tobacco and cannabis together, right?
In the US, but I was talking to someone from Europe and they're like, that's the only way I consume. So it'll be really interesting to see how that market comes online in terms of I know a lot of European friends, they only smoke spliffs. And I know like even in LA, right? Like a blunt, that is a huge product and it's cultural, but you can't wrap cannabis in a tobacco product right now. So I wonder if that could potentially change in the future.
Yeah, I used to go to Amsterdam a lot when I worked in the investment business. We had money with a manager called TransTrend, and they were in Rotterdam, which is just an hour or so train ride away. So I was in Amsterdam 2 or 3 times a year for about 5 years. And you're absolutely right. That's how they like to consume in Europe. And you're seen as a little bit strange if you smoke a joint that's just straight weed. And also totally hear you on the blunt thing. Those are super popular. But like what you're saying, if you go to a dispensary and you buy what they call a blunt, that's some sort of like a bamboo wrap or leaf wrap, but you can't blend the tobacco. To my knowledge, guys, maybe you know better than me, but I'm not aware of a legal market where you can blend the tobacco and the cannabis and sell it in a dispensary, right?
Thing.
Yeah. And so maybe down the road that does exist, but those are certainly kept separate today.
Just to reiterate one of the things you said, Jesse, because I think it's so important to say, we've got the tobacco industry, right? That's got massive resources where a lot of people are consuming less and less tobacco than they did in the past. On the left side, we have the alcohol industry where people are drinking way less. They also have massive resources. And then we've got this poor cannabis industry that is hamstrung with all these challenges. And we've got both these titans that are excited to try to come in and gobble up the market share. Is that a fair way to describe what we think is currently happening?
I think so, but if we're being realistic, I think they probably also see the challenges, right? And so we've been light on the state-led growth story in that, year over year revenue for the top operators was pretty flat because unless meaningful new states turn on, little improvements are offset by price compression and as states mature. And so I struggle with this a little bit because I see that opportunity moving forward, especially as these key states like your Floridas, your Pennsylvanias unlock. But also when I look back and I say, how did we get here? What did we miss? We've been wrong, and the projections have been wrong about how quickly this industry was going to grow. And if you put on your bearish hat, you can say, yeah, that's because you have these limited license markets where you have these adult use flips and things are super healthy for a while. Then things degrade and they become just average markets over time and the revenue drops. But I can say on the flip side of that, it was Abner Curtin, executive chairman of Ascend, who said to me a couple of years ago that don't get stressed about year over year changes as much because this industry tends to have a stair-step growth pattern where it'll be flat for 12, 18 months. And then hopefully Florida and Pennsylvania come online and you have that stair-step where the industry can grow, 20% pretty quickly. And so, I guess I don't know, Brian, maybe I have PTSD from all the challenges that we've faced. But just whenever I hear something that sounds too optimistic, like they're just chomping at the bit to be here, I say, I think they're having a hard look at it, but I think it's also critical that all of us are just as honest as possible and double check our thesis as much to say, hey, I've kind of been wrong. I'll raise my hand. I've been too optimistic the last couple of years. I would say that about me more 22, 23. I would say this year I was not too optimistic about things, but I've gotten better about that. I think my understanding has improved, but I would say that there are challenges in this space and there are opportunities. And it's kind of the job of all of us, including the ones on the outside that are thinking about joining the party here, to say, okay, we've seen the challenges, which are what's happened in California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, right? Those initial markets, kind of those legacy West Coast markets, by and large, aren't super attractive, haven't been super attractive investments. There's been exceptions to it. You contrast that, you say, oh, but look at that other side over here. You've got some great states, like you've got your New Jerseys, your Illinois has stayed a good state for a long time. Maryland's hanging in there pretty well. Ohio is off to a good start, maybe a great start once the full regulations get rolled out. But when we talk about cannabis in the US, sometimes we paint it with one brush when it's really trying to put together almost like it's a multinational corporation business model where we have all these different countries, all these different silos, then we try to aggregate them together and say, okay, what's the health of this overall? And sometimes it's difficult, I think, to make that generalization.
I think that's really well said. And while we're being honest, I'll put my hand in the air. We've done about 250 episodes. I think I've gotten about 225 wrong predictions. So I don't want to...
Welcome. Welcome.
Pretty wrong about. What do you think about state packs, interstate commerce? Do you have any feeling that you think that could be a pretty big catalyst that happens in the future?
Yeah, I just think the timing on that might be a ways off. Maybe it's easier to get done on the West Coast if you take states like California, Nevada, and Arizona, and you will be able to just move cannabis to one of those two states, crossing fewer state lines. But I think it also begs the question, like, what's in it for these other states? Like, does Nevada want to decimate its cultivation by bringing in cannabis from California? Same thing for Arizona. And so I think over time we get there, but I think we need to line up the incentives maybe a little bit better than we have. Like, it's clear, right? It's really clear why California wants interstate commerce, because we want to supply the rest of the country with this great cannabis that we have. And if we just look at it objectively, it is smarter to grow cannabis in California than it is, especially in states where it's cold or super humid. So it does make sense in that context, but just need to work out how does it work for the person on the other side of the trade. So if you're in California and you're exporting the cannabis, that works well for you. But if you're Nevada or Arizona importing the cannabis, what is the benefit to them? To the consumer, you could see a benefit, but to the existing businesses, it seems like it would present some really steep competition. And so with businesses like, Glass House or Leaf or even, Gold Flora, who we cover, who has a huge cultivation facility in Desert Hot Springs that's super beautiful. All of those, I think, have long-term opportunities to plant flags in other states and have huge markets when interstate commerce opens up. I just don't see that happening in the near term. So I think of that as a call option with those businesses. If you're going to invest in a California company, put that in your back pocket and say, oh, by the way, I have this low-cost call option that if and when interstate happens, this will be a benefit to their business, but it wouldn't invest really as that being a necessary part of your thesis.
It's wild that we're going to have to wait to see the industry come full circle, right? Like, it used to be the fact that California grew all the cannabis for everyone. Mm-hmm. And then everyone got involved. And now it's like, nah, we're all going to do our own thing for a couple of years, make a big mess, and then we'll go back to how we used to do it.
Yeah. Don't you think we grow oranges in 52 states?
or maybe wine is even a better example, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm in Santa Barbara, and we're known for our Pinots here. And if you go to Napa, they're known for their cabs and different varietals there. But I can't name my favorite wine from Minnesota.
Fair.
Me neither.
Slightly switching gears, one of the things I enjoy most is reading some of your research. Can you kind of give us a breakdown on how it works and kind of who the target audience is for some of the information?
Yeah, so Water Tower Research, we have about 16 analysts and we cover 12 different sectors. So sometimes people learned about Water Tower Research through me and they think it's just me and a couple of guys covering cannabis. Well, really, I was brought in when the firm was already covering, I think, 10 sectors, and I was the first person to cover cannabis. Water Tower Research was founded by former top people from the sell side. So the director of research from Lehman was one of the founders, and he eventually was director of research at Citigroup. We have analysts from Goldman, Morgan Stanley, really all across the street. We're big in tech, energy, healthcare, kind of our flagship sectors. We cover cannabis, we cover a bit of psychedelics as well. And really what I like about our platform is the open access nature of it. So with a lot of the sell side shops out there, you have to be one of their top 50 clients to get their research, and the retail investor doesn't have access to the reports on their favorite companies. We've democratized that and created an open access system. So if I write research about, Gold Flora, Leaf Brands, Hydrofarm, whichever of our clients it may be, those are available to everyone. So you can just go to watertowerresearch.com, click on the sectors tab, click on cannabis, and anyone can read all of our research. And so I think that's really critical in our sector, because one of the weird structural dynamics is that this is about 95% retail investors in cannabis. The top 5 MSOs are about 7% institutionally owned. So this is a really retail heavy sector. So when I'm writing, guys, I'm trying to write institutional quality research that can still be digested and consumed and valuable to retail investors. And so for our clients, we publish generally 1 or 2 pieces of content per month. I tend to do about 2/3 written work and about 1/3 interviews. The interviews we do sometimes are spaces on X, sometimes they're fireside chats on Zoom, sometimes they're on our podcast platform, which could be my Higher Exchanges podcast I do with Morgan Paxia every week, or could be our Small Cap Spotlight podcast. So we have a few different channels to get the message out there. But what we really specialize in is putting out consistent bite-sized content. We're very aware of the short attention spans out there in the world. So we're not looking to write 20 or 30 pages anymore. I think the longest report I've written is an initiation of coverage report that was probably 25 pages. And that's still a lot to ask somebody to read. But once we get that flagship initiation of coverage report out there, then it's more consistent, 1, 2, 3 pages of content and or interviews to continually be educating people. And so, we cover we cover specific companies. We cover ones that are in California. We cover the pick and shovels we talked about with Hydrofarm, and also write just a lot of industry research as well. You can find all of that stuff, like I said, at watertowerresearch.com, or follow me on LinkedIn or X, and I tend to share everything there as well.
What's your favorite part about that research? Do you enjoy the interviews the most, or kind of just like diving into the writing aspect?
I enjoy the conversations the most. And so I think you guys have figured this out from doing the podcast, that you just through a channel like this, you get to have so many amazing conversations with people in the industry, share information, and learn so much. And so I'm always grateful to go to something like Benzinga. And we had, I think, 18 meetings over the 2 or 3 day period. I think 15 of them were with operators, the rest with investors. And so I'm just, grateful to be able to do things like moderate the keynote with Charlie Bachtel from Cresco. I'm grateful to do things like, be able to spend a half hour talking to someone, like Jason Wild. I'm grateful to, spend time having dinner with someone like Leaf Brands that dominates the California extract market. These are all things when I was getting into cannabis. Honestly, guys, doing things like being on podcasts like this that I've listened to for a long time. When I got into this, I have a unique, somewhat compelling background that I did the investment thing for a long time, and then I rolled my sleeves up and I ran a store for 3 years. But when I got into the cannabis and investing part, I didn't know anyone. Jason Wild was the first person I interviewed, and that's because I did a show on Seeking Alpha called CEO Interviews, and Jason came on that, and that was the first person that I did a formal interview with in the cannabis space. And it's been a lot of work and a lot of challenges to get to a place now where I have a voice and I have these conversations, and I'm really grateful for that. And so I like digging in. I like doing the writing. I like doing the spreadsheet work as well. But I'd say probably the part of it I enjoy the most is just the conversations we get to have.
I got to expand on that. I got to wonder, sometimes you probably go in thinking one thing about a company, but as you kind of get behind the curtains, you realize that things are way different than you initially thought. And that's probably like a fun aspect for you to be like, oh, I always thought like this was their specialty, but really like this is what makes this company super unique.
Yes, and you learn so much more by going and seeing the assets. And so that's something that I've put a lot more focus on this year is going out, doing site visits, going to grows, going to the stores, going and seeing the extraction lab, and not just to see the equipment and the plants and whatever else, the retail, but also talking to the people in those places. So there's no right way to grow cannabis. And so you can go great indoor, great outdoor. You can do it great in hydro. You can do it great in soil. You can do great HPS. You can do great LED. There's no one right answer. But when you go out and, for example, Gold Flora has this guy named Philip Haig, who's their head of cultivation. And I ask a bunch of questions, and I don't ask a question about what nutrients do you use? Do you flush your plants? What medium do you grow in? What kind of lights do you use? I ask all these questions, not because I think there's a right answer, right? You can grow fire cannabis under LED or HPS, but I like to see that someone has thought it through. And so I think what you're saying there, Brian, is right on. But I think that one of the things I've enjoyed most in 2024 has been going out and not just meeting the C-suites, but also meeting the growers, meet the head of extraction. When we were in Chicago, I saw you guys out at Forefront Ventures doing a tour of their new cultivation facility and just getting to see the people. We saw the woman that was showing us the extraction equipment. I asked a million questions to the grower. On the bus back, I was, informally interviewing Andrew, the CEO. And through those different conversations, then you can start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And I don't know about you guys, but once I left that tour, I had just a way better understanding of Forefront, even though I've known them for years. But after seeing the assets, it just really helped crystallize the story.
Perfect. That was perfectly said, and was a one-of-one experience for sure. Tell me something that is true that nobody agrees with you on.
I'm not really a hot take person. I would say maybe a misunderstanding that frustrates me is the lack of appreciation for sun-grown cannabis. I think we wrongly put things in a bucket where we say, oh, well, if we have a good, better, best approach, the good might be the outdoor, the better might be the greenhouse, and the best will be the indoor. And that is just absolutely not true and is, a false categorization or a hierarchy. And so being in Santa Barbara, we have an ideal climate for growing things. Like we have some of the best strawberries in the world and, a lot of great produce is grown here. And the same thing happens with cannabis. And you can grow just absolutely fantastic flower here. And my favorite flower, guys, is what we call light dep or, light deprivation, where somebody can be doing something as having, polyurethane hoop house, and then they pull a black tarp over it to create the 12-12 lighting cycle. And they can get an additional sun-grown harvest doing it that way. A lot of times those happen in July, then they'll replant, and then they'll do the same thing again in the fall and get a couple of turns out of that sun-grown harvest. And some of the best flower that I've had is just from smaller farms, organic, soil grown under the California sun. But in most markets, that cannabis gets painted with one brush and overlooked because people want, the indoor that's 35% THC and turns purple and tastes like candy, right? That's like the flavor of the month in cannabis. Whereas for me, what I get super excited about, like if you said, Jesse, we're giving you the electric chair tonight, what's the last cannabis you would like to smoke? I would pick some sort of a green OG Kush that was sun-grown. And so I don't think that's a super hot take, but I would say I think we're kind of going down a weird road on the cannabis side where we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater on a lot of these really great legacy strains. So like go smoke some Gorilla Glue and tell me how stoned you get versus the latest gelato crust. The Gorilla Glue is going to be way stonier, but because it doesn't test as high in THC, there isn't as much of a market for it. Same with a lot of the great OGs. They'll test 18, 19, 21, 22% THC, but they will get you way more stoned than the latest, candy gas runs cross that tests at 32% THC and turns purple. And so I think that, something I'm passionate about is bringing back sun-grown cannabis and also educating the market on this misnomer around THC and this notion of, I always need the strongest thing, but also is the strongest thing necessarily the thing that's highest in THC? I think the answer to that is probably no. When you go to wineries out here, I'm sure you guys have been to a winery before or bought a bottle of wine in the restaurant. Did you ever say to the sommelier or the person at the winery, hey, which one is the strongest? I just want the strongest thing that you have. They would look at you and say, sir, are you an alcoholic? Have you never drank wine before? And so when you go to you want a whole experience, and getting a buzz is part of that, but you also like the flavor and the smell and everything else that goes with it. And I think cannabis, we eventually more evolve towards that wine direction, where we're not just going into the liquor store and saying, give me the Everclear, but we're looking for the most well-rounded, best tasting, richest experience. And one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways to find that experience, I think, is opening your palate to things like sun-grown and some of these legacy strains that may not have the sexiest numbers, but do have some of the best effects out there.
I couldn't agree with that more. And it's one of my biggest pet peeves right now, especially in Colorado, right, where we don't have the optimal outdoor growing conditions. You've seen this huge push towards indoor that has to look a certain way, has to test a certain potency. And in all honesty, it's completely ruined the smokability of the plant. It's not fun. It's dry. It's like paper. I don't think it has any flavor.
Yep.
And so it's like really tarnished my personal opinion on cannabis flower. And actually, the funniest thing is 710 Labs actually came to Colorado, and they actually have legitimate California flower. And I went and found some the other day, and I was like, what? It finally. And so like, I couldn't agree more. And I just wanted to piggyback on that. It's a real issue. And like the whole potency chasing thing is creating a product that's just not the same as it used to be. So
yeah, the 710 guys are great. One of my favorite things that they do is their living soil indoor.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah. And so you get the benefits of soil, especially living soil, but you can do it more consistently under light. So I think that's super interesting, because I think one of the reasons all the cannabis starts looking and tasting the same is because A, we're using very similar genetics. 2 is we're growing them under similar lights, and 3 is we're growing them with similar nutrients. So how many people are using, Athena, for example, is super huge out here. So if we all are doing kind of the same thing, just in different boxes across the country, it kind of starts all looking and tasting the same. And either how many strains right now just have this weird kind of floral, fruity candy type profile. You can't tell if it's a lemon cherry gelato. You can't tell if it's a runce. It's all kind of just blending into being the same. And so maybe there's an opportunity there with differentiation. But I was thinking about this at Benzinga, and maybe the reason that this doesn't happen as much or as quickly as guys like us would want is because the hardcore weed smoker in California generally isn't going to the dispensary.
Yes,
they're going to their traditional market, their normal guy. And so there are people who buy all of their flower from the legal market. When I was running the dispensary, there's a lot of people that smoke an ounce of flower a week, right? Yeah. And so those people would rather get the quantity discount, sometimes the fresher product that might come from, their friend, versus going to the store. So maybe that's why the stores, the craft brands, there are, examples of ones that do well, like your 710s, your Cannabiotics, your Fig Farms in California. There are a bunch of those, but I think you're seeing more people tailor towards what I think is kind of good enough flower that serves the masses, but maybe is not exactly what the 3 of us would like.
Dream smoking session, 3 people, dead or alive.
Evan Jodrey, you know who he is?
No, I don't.
Legacy cultivator in Humboldt County. He's kind of a consultant out there, but if you just Google his name, tons of educational videos, and just knows so much about cannabis and educated me so much when I was getting up the curve. I would say I like Ted from Alien Labs.
Yeah, he's cool.
I think he's a cool guy. I think he grows fire. I just always enjoy the conversations with him. And the last one is my friend from Sugar Magnolia Farms in Santa Barbara. Because when I wanted to get into cannabis, he was a friend of my sister's. They made that introduction, and he helped me back in the medical days get involved in the California market, and has grown some of the absolute best flower and best rosin that I've ever consumed. And it's just a super fun guy to get high with. So I'm going to go with Kevin Jodrey from Humboldt, Ted the stud from Alien Labs, and the homie from Sugar Magnolia Farms.
I love it. What question do you wish more people asked you?
Why are you here? Because I think that's lost, right? I'm not a legacy farmer, but I'll also argue I'm not a corporate Chad. And I think I have a unique perspective by trying to put those 2 pieces of the puzzle together. Like, I really fucking care Like, I don't know if you can say fucking on this podcast, but
my mom doesn't listen. You can
Okay.
certainly say it.
yeah. So I actually like really fucking care what happens. Like, yeah, making money is great, but I've seen cannabis change my dad's life. And I ran a medical dispensary and signed up the first 1,000 patients myself and delivered to people with cataracts and Parkinson's and cancer, and help people do things that really improve their lives. And that was a massive like cleansing experience coming from the hedge fund industry, where it was all about shaving pennies and picking up nickels and dimes and making as much money as possible, but had no real purpose behind it outside of that. Where when I came to cannabis, I thought, wow, maybe there's a business opportunity here, but maybe there's actually a way to improve people's lives. And I think that's kind of lost in where we are sometimes, especially on social media, where we're forgetting the actual value of the plant. Like when I go to these events, guys, like whether it's the Glasshouse Analyst Day, the Forefront Tour, or any time when the cannabis investing community congregates, especially the analysts, you have all these people that don't even actually smoke weed. They've never grown a plant before. They're just awesome at, modeling CPG stuff and putting it in a spreadsheet. And that's cool, but I think there's more to it than that. And I think that ultimately to really understand the industry and be a valuable long-term player, it helps to have some connection to the plant, some why. Like, why do you actually care? Why are you actually here? And I think it was Obi Strickler from Grown Rogue, who I brought up a couple of times. They're not a client. I guess he's just been on my mind because we interviewed him recently. But he said, Jesse, you're providing a really valuable service. You're bridging the gap between the hippies and the suits. And that really resonated with me because I want to find a way, hopefully, to make a lot of money, guys. It'd be disingenuous to not say that, right? Like I have kids, I want to retire someday, yada, yada, yada. I want to make a lot of money. I'll be upfront about that. But I also want to find a way to help move the industry forward and to help people. And the opportunity within cannabis isn't just about money. It's really about the chance to improve people's lives. And I 100% believe that more cannabis is a better thing. And whether it's on the recreational side, moving people away, right? Have we all seen people get damaged from alcohol? Does that resonate with you guys?
Yes.
Yes.
And we all know things like smoking aren't great for you. And so I think transitioning the recreational community towards cannabis is a healthy thing. It's probably, in my mind, of the head changes available out there. Like if we just are honest, a lot of us like to have some sort of a head change. And what's one that has a medical value is maybe the least detrimental for you. Maybe no cannabis might be better than some cannabis. We can argue about that. But if you want to use something for a head change, I think cannabis might be the best option in terms of the reward to risk ratio, meaning it gives you some relief and some benefits, but it has the least downside. So I think on a recreational basis, we can change a lot of lives by getting people away from drinking. I think about that with my home state of Minnesota coming online, where it's such a huge drinking culture out there and people dying of cirrhosis. I worked in the construction business there when I was a kid, and I saw guys drinking 6-packs on the way home. They have an hour drive. They'd finish a 6-pack on the way home. And that was just, common culture out there. So I think that we could really improve lives in that way. Then number two is absolutely on the medical side. We need to open up more research. We need to hear thousands of examples of cases like my dad, thousands of examples of people transitioning off things like opiates to things like cannabis, because A, it's going to make their pain better, but B, you're not going to get all of the nasty side effects that you get from some of these other drugs. And so it turned out to be a longer answer to the question. But yeah, I think the question, why are you here is important. And I think that people that really have that purpose, have that why, I think will have better staying power and potentially the most valuable contributions.
I think that was beautiful said. So Jesse, last question, prediction. 1 year from now, what has changed?
1 year from now, I think Schedule 3 is final. I think Florida has started adult use sales. And I think we'll have seen a Garland memo.
I love it. And optimism is back. So Jesse, for our listeners, they want to get in touch. They want to get some of your podcasts and they want to do some research. Where can they find you?
Sure. So find me on social media at my name, JESSEREDMOND. Read my research at watertowerresearch.com. Click on the sectors tab and go to cannabis. Listen to our podcast called Higher Exchanges. I do that every week with Morgan Paxia of Poseidon. And if you want to reach out and say hello, you can just email me directly, jesse@watertowerresearch.com.
Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me, guys.